in the special issue, we're trying to reframe it a little bit. So what might be desirable realities? Because of course that lens of performativity is all about shaping realities. So it might well be a current reality, but I stop there and give the floor to Juliane. Juliane, do you have a presentation that you would like to share? Or
I do have a presentation. So I'm going to share my screen.
Please.
Hello everyone, and thanks for inviting me to coming on to this seminar. Okay, wait. Just need to make sure I have the right one here, which it is. So okay. Can you see my presentation? Does it look fine to you?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, okay, great. And I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, okay. So how can we know what's a desirable future reality anyways? First of all, I must say I saw the call for the special issue and I'm really excited that you're taking this on, and I think it will produce like some very cutting edge thinking around this topic around, you know, what is our role in terms of producing impactful scholarship, performativity, and really kind of pushing the boundary a little bit. And I think that's exactly what you want with a special issue. So I'm just outlining my perspective on desirable future reality. How do we know this? How does it relate to theorizing? And I will focus specifically on the aspect of desirability in this presentation. So I suppose why you invited me to be one of the keynote speakers is because I have with different collaborators thought quite hard in the last couple of years around how can we as scholars contribute to while co-creating desirable realities or desirable futures. So with Eva Boxenbaum and Joel Gehman, we talked about impactful theory and really thinking about theory not as being juxtaposed to impact, but really thinking about how can theory itself become impactful, right? And so kind of putting the two words together rather than thinking, okay, on the one hand we have theory and on the other hand we have impact, but really thinking about, no, actually these come together. Nothing is as practical as a good theory, right? So thinking how can we actually make this happen? And then with Ali Gümüşay, we have worked on this notion of desirable futures and thinking about prospective theorizing to get to kind of desirable futures. And I will go a little bit into this, but with a focus on the desirability impact. I think what really, struck me and where I think I really, started to think about this aspect was during the pandemic. I think when we were all sitting at home and having this kind of crisis of personal meaning, thinking, what are we actually doing, and what is our role as scholars, and how can we change the way we do scholarship in a way to have a greater impact on reality, because that's what I think many many of us are motivated by. This kind of resonates with other scholars who have, criticized organization management theory as being, stuck in a narrow paradigm-driven theory fetish, who are concerned with gap spotting, and also there have been analyses here. This paper in Nature that came out recently that has actually analyzed not only in the social sciences, but also in life sciences, physical sciences, technologies, papers, and patterns, and have argued, well, actually, science is becoming less disruptive. So we are less ambitious in our theorizing. We're kind of more developing paradigms forward, but we're kind of less disruptive, developing less disruptive theories. And I think that's maybe related to, this criticism of being stuck in a paradigm-driven theory fetish. And I fully kind of acknowledge a bit of a, paradoxical situation here, because as an associate editor at the Academy of Management Journal and other journal editors and BGM as well, right? We're always kind of focusing, okay, what is theoretical contribution? And hence this notion that it's not about it's not about abandoning theory and focusing more on kind of the empirics, but it's actually thinking about, how can theory itself and theorizing itself become more impactful. And so with Eva Boxenbaum and Joel Gehman, we thought about, what are the pathways to mattering? So I think what is most interesting to the discussion today is we identified kind of 3 different ways of how theory will have an impact on practice: the transfer model of impact, the performative model, and the co-creation model. And I think the performative model of impact, where impact emerges as theory is performed in practice, is one of greatest interest here. And the typical performativity of theory, and we'll have interventions on this later today, looks at how theory intervenes in the world as it is enacted, and often not necessarily deliberately. The theory is not created with the aim of creating an impact in the world, but it's almost like the impact in the world is almost like a byproduct of theorizing. And so the theory becomes true as people start to enact the theory. Now, you could then also take it one further and say, well, what if researchers actually would create theories with the very explicit aim for these theories to become performative? And some scholars have called this critical performativity. I think Andre Spicer and Mats Alvesen wrote about this as critical performativity. But basically, this is kind of using this idea of performativity of theories intervening in the world to transform the world by theorizing about it. And maybe we can think about it, it's a deliberate constructivism. So we want to construct the world as we theorize about it. And I think this is kind of this kind of spectrum of where trying to theorize desirable realities or desirable future realities comes in, but trying to offer kind of new models of how desirable reality could look like, trying to encourage, practitioners and the world out there to take this seriously and hopefully enacting this theory. So that's kind of really thinking about impactful theory for co-creating this desirable future reality. And I think this has kind of 2 aspects. And one is impactful theory, this move towards relevant, moving away from business as usual, and not thinking about theory and impact as opposed, but really thinking about them as informing one another. The other step that I think is required is what Ali and we've been talking about this in terms of prospective theorizing. So creating this kind of impact and societal relevance through theorizing desirable institution, a desirable future reality. And I think this really goes kind of a bit away from, and I think we can talk about this in terms of the future, but also in terms of present reality. Often the realities that we study, they're maybe not desirable, right? And as empirical social science scholars, we often limit ourselves to what is out there as data, and then we theorize on the data. And if we think about, the big societal transformations that are really needed in terms of, decarbonization, more equal forms of organizing, often it's really hard to theorize them because we don't have enough good examples out there. So that really kind of limits ourselves as social science scholars of how we can, use theorizing to create an impact in the world. And I think that's kind of the idea of prospective theorizing. Can we think about forms of how we can theorize a desirable reality that kind of breaks free from maybe the constraints of what if this desirable reality is not available out there that we can theorize? And how can we then move beyond kind of these empirical straitjacket? And so we have defined prospective theorizing as a future-oriented approach to theorizing that is concerned with imagining desirable futures. And this prospective theorizing, the idea is to, if you have theorizing, it's typically the criteria through which we evaluate theorizing is that we think about theorizing as a representation of reality, an explanation of why we see certain things in reality. And that is the first criterion through which we judge good theorizing. Now, if we move away from this more positivist and representational approach to what theorizing is, and thinking more adopting pragmatist philosophy, then, the idea of truth becomes not a representation of reality, but truth becomes more a question to the tied to the question of what is useful. So that usefulness becomes a pragmatic criterion. So we move from kind of a truthful representation, a mirror of reality, to thinking about the consequences of theorizing as a pragmatic criterion. It would also be thinking about theorizing as preparatory, preparing for plausible and implausible possibilities. And possibly think about theorizing as something as prefigurative, that would embrace performativity of bringing theory into being, the constitution of new worlds through the articulation, as Raghu Garwood and Joel Gaiman have talked about this. Now, this requires two conceptual leaps. And the one leap is to move from theorizing and scholarship as being values neutral to making values-led claim, right? Once we talk about desirable reality, desirable futures, that kind of brings in values. And it has the possibility to maybe counteract the dominance of the current values, because all theory is value-laden. We don't always make the kind of the value-led underpinnings of our theorizing explicit, right? By the very moment that we choose profitability or revenues as a dependent variable, we implicitly say that this is important. We implicitly assign a value to it, but we don't always admit that this is value-led theorizing. And by deliberately embracing values in our theorizing, we could use theorizing then to counteract the dominance of capitalist values, patriarchal values that do already exist, albeit implicitly knowledge production, and embrace the generative potential of developing institutional imaginaries and alternatives. So, as I said, I will focus on the values part of the prospective theorizing. The other part is around moving from projection to imagination and the role of imagination. So if we then think about the modes of theorizing desirable future realities, we have on one axis, we have from projection to imagination, and on the other one from values neutral to values led. So this leads us to, it's a very simplified model, but this is a one way of trying to conceptualize, to projected desirable future realities and imagine desirable future realities that are values-led. And I will give you some examples and some criteria for how can we then think, if we want to think about theorizing a desirable future reality, who decides what is desirable? And what are maybe the theorying practices that we should think about? And so in this shift towards values, maybe our input of theorizing would shift to maybe more values-led data, where we would think about who decides about the values that count, and we would have to think about ways to co-creating the input to our theorizing in a way that is more deliberative, that is more purposeful, where we become more mindful of who participates in sort of the production of data or the production of input, so that we arrive at a more at a more diverse, at a more deliberative, at a more purposeful input into this sort of theorizing. So we would have to become a lot more conscious around what is our input to theorizing. I think it would also require a lot more reflexivity around what do we theorize about? So how do we maybe extrapolate these values? And I mentioned kind of, the dependent variable, if it's profit, revenues, growth, what if we change it? What if we say regeneration or biodiversity is the dependent variable. And we want to see what kind of organization practices, what business models actually are there to maximize biodiversity or regenerative business. That would be a completely different way of how we kind of bring in values and try to theorize. Then the output of theorizing, in our traditional theorizing, the theoretical model or the framework that we then produce, that could be around making purposive abstractions that make visible the normative assumptions and postulates that are part of our theorizing. And there could also be more open-ended images, metaphors, narratives that inspire open-ended imagination and kind of put these values out there also for debate with audiences who we want to impact, rather than kind of pretending that this is value neutral theorizing. And so just to give you some ideas around the what this type of theorizing could look like and how this could come in. So in the bottom left-hand side quadrant, we would have projected desirable futures. And so these are kind of desirable realities that have been enacted in the world and that we can then study. So Ellen Oren Wright wrote about this as real utopias that exist on the fault line between dreams and practice. I find this such a beautiful definition. And so they're real because they do exist, alternative forms of organizing. However, they're also utopian because they exist on the fringes, on the periphery. They're not part of the mainstream. Another concept which I personally find very useful is that of prefigurative organizing, which is the idea of enacting the desired future reality in the present. And what these projected desirable futures allow us to do is to think about desirability as practice. So these kind of alternative forms of organizing, they're testing the desirability through practice. So personally, for instance, I've studied the Occupy movement as a horizontal form of organizing when it was in London in front of St. Paul's Cathedral. And it was very much based on the idea that the means of organizing should reflect the ends of the society that they want to create. So the organizing itself has to be horizontal, has to be inclusive, has to be based on consensus-oriented decision-making rather than hierarchy. But of course, that also brings out all the difficulties with such models and allows to think about refining those models and testing where do these models work, what do these models work less, so kind of the boundary conditions of such desirable futures and such desirable reality, and allows for participation and deliberation around these alternative forms of organizing. So here desirability is being practiced by these alternative forms and allow kind of testing them out. Just trying to move. So another, on the bottom right-hand side quadrant, we would have desirability as a criterion, but also kind of bringing in imagination. And here desirability would appear more as a thought experiment, because here we are talking about models of organizing, models of the economy that don't yet exist. I was very inspired by, the concept of the circular economy by the when it first came out. And of course, we don't really see circular, organizing as the dominant model of how our economy works. Yet this idea of circular economy has, I would argue, become quite performative and has inspired businesses to try to create circular business models and create circularity and enact the kind of concept of a circular economy. So in that sense, the desirability becomes more a thought experiment defined as judgments about what would happen if an imagined scenario were real. But then inspiring practitioners to actually try it out. Another example is or our colleague here at Oxford, Kate Raworth, theorized around the donut economics. And here you see kind of the idea of the donut being organized, the economy being organized as a donut, where you have the outer boundary of the donut are the biophysical constraints that concern the health of our planet: climate change, ocean acidification, chemical pollution. And if our economy overshoots, then this harms our kind of planetary health. But there's also a social foundation for the donut. And this is really around water, food, health, education, income, peace, justice, social equity, and so on. And creating a shortfall on this dimension also means that we don't enact an economy that creates a safe and just space for humanity. So we have an ecological ceiling and a social foundation. So now that describes a desirable economic model. And her Donut Economics Lab, which go to the website, has amazing sets of resources, slides that you can all use in your teaching, and which I do a lot, then looks at how different countries enact the donut economics, and has also inspired cities around the world to create participatory sessions with citizens, for instance, in cities, to think about what would the donut economics look like in our city. And so it's been put out there as a thought experiment. What if our economy looked like a donut and would take seriously the social foundation and the ecological ceiling? Now, how do we know what's desirable, and whether this, whose desirability matters? So one thing which the donut economy illustrates is how science becomes a guardrail for desirability. So the donut donut is ultimately based on the planetary boundaries that first came out by Johan Rockström and colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and has since been updated. Unfortunately, it had to be updated because when it first was published, we had breached 3 of the planetary boundaries, and now you can see we have already breached 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries. So this is a safe operating space. This is the ecological ceiling that the donut economics incorporates into the framework. And so the thought experiment can have some scientific knowledge, insights, used as boundaries. On the other hand, we could think about values guardrails, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and thinking about, desirability, has to respect some of these very basic, values that are universally agreed upon. And then within that space, of course, there's a lot of space for deliberation of what then desirability looks like. So I think I will end the presentation here to leave time for questions and not disrupt this beautifully curated schedule that we have, all being on time, and stop maybe sharing the screen here. But maybe just to sum it up, to say a desirable reality can be, I think, as scholars, we could play a part in helping with our tools of researching and theorizing to explore and to reflect on what desirability looks like and how it's enacted in practice, both through studying existing examples of how people practice this, but also potentially pushing it to thinking around, maybe new forms of theorizing desirability, like something like the donut economics, thinking about completely new models, but then also thinking about, what are the guardrails to this type of theorizing, and how, when it's put in practice, we could build in reflective practices that then allow kind of participants, in impact speak, we say beneficiaries, right, to try out, deliberate, and practice the desirability. Okay,